Hi everyone, in this video I want to look at the question, why does negative a times negative b equal a times b? Or in other words, why is it the case that when we take one negative number and multiply it by another negative number, we end up with a positive number? It's a somewhat counterintuitive result. And what prompted me to think about this is a few weeks ago in my Master of Teaching, we were taking a look at this question and thinking about how we would explain it to students who were learning it for the first time. And I know personally, when I was in high school, wasn't the kind of student who really would have thought about this too deeply. I was the kind of student who would have, been shown this by the teacher, committed it to memory, and then been able to kind of make use of it whenever I had to when answering questions. But I wasn't the kind of student who would have really thought about why in any deep way. And because of that, I don't really, or I didn't anyway, have at hand a good answer to the question, why is this the case? So the reason I want to record this video is to now share how I would explain this if a student was to ask me, why do two negative numbers multiplied end up with a positive number? And naturally, I don't think this explanation I'm going to give is necessarily the best way. It's obviously not the only way. There's many ways you could try and explain this. But at least for now, it's the way that I think makes sense. I think it's a way that I could kind of articulate to students, and hopefully most of them would find it helpful, and it might help at least provide a first step to explaining why this result is the way it is. So hopefully you find it helpful too if you're learning this for the first time, or if it's something you've known for a long time but just never really thought too deeply about why. Hopefully the way I'm about to explain it helps in some little way. If you have your own ways to explain it that you think are also helpful, please feel free to share in the comments. I think that would be a good thing to see lots of different ways to grapple with this. But the way I'd like to explain it starts by breaking up this left-hand side a little bit. So what we can do is we can say negative a times negative b. What that really is if we think of negative a first, that's really just negative 1 times a. Hopefully that's not too controversial. If we have negative of a number, it's really just the positive version multiplied by negative 1. So that deals with that bit. Then we've got our times. And now with negative b, we can do the same thing. We can say negative b is negative 1 times b. And even though it doesn't look like I've done a lot, breaking it up in this way means that because we're dealing with multiplication signs and the order that we multiply doesn't make a difference, what we can do is we can bring these negative ones together. We can say this right-hand side can be written as negative 1 times negative 1 times a times b. And I think what this helps to make really clear is to get this result here, well, the a times b we've got. So really what this implies is that this negative 1 times negative 1 is what kind of simplifies to positive 1. So really, to answer this question, all we really need to do now is think about why negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. And if we can convince ourselves of that, we've kind of really then got our general solution of any number, negative, any number negative, multiply them and you end up with the positive version of that. So now we need to think, well, why is negative 1 times negative 1 positive 1? And a way we can think about that hopefully is helpful is to draw up a number line. So I'll just get my ruler here and we'll draw up a number line. It doesn't need to be particularly long, but if I call this 0, and let's just think of a few numbers. So say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's probably enough. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then obviously the number line continues. And now if we go the other way, so negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, and then so on. So here's our number line. And I think a very simple thing we can do that might help is think about our negative 1 times tables. So you probably remember learning your times tables very early on as you started learning math, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times tables and so on. Well, we're going to do, just for a few simple numbers, our -1 times tables and see if we spot a pattern. And it might just help if I kind of draw a dashed line here, just to kind of visually make clear what's happening. Because if we start, let's start with 5. So 5, the positive number 5, what's -1 times 5? -1 times 5 is -5. So we've started here at this 5, and we've kind of jumped over to -5. If we start at 4, what's -1 times 4? Well, that's just -4. What's -1 times 3? That's just -3. -1 times 2 is -2. -1 times 1 is -1. -1 times 0 is 0. We don't move. And so hopefully you've spotted a pattern that for each number in the positive part, when we multiply it by -1, we jump to the opposite side. And so now as we've moved back and we get up to -1, -1 times -1, well, if we're going to follow this pattern, we just start jumping again around 0. So -1 times -1 would be +1. -1 times -2 would be +2, and so on. But really, we only need to think about it for this first one. So really, kind of what I'm trying to show here is there's this pattern, this visual pattern where whenever we take a number and multiply it by -1, what we're doing is we're jumping across 0 to the other side. So once we get into the negative territory, our -1 times tables, the rule is still the same. It's just we'll jump to the other side of 0. So that's kind of at least one simple visual way, at least on the number line, you can think, well, why is -1 times -1 +1? It's because we start at -1 and then we jump to the other side, because that's what we do with our -1s times tables. So continuing on with this kind of basic algebra, what we end up with is -a times -b equals -1 times -1 times a times b. -1 times -1 we've just seen is +1 times a times b. And then mathematical convention says 1 times something you don't really need to write, so you just end up with a times b. Sonic boom! And so there you have it. There's one possible explanation to help understand why two negative numbers multiplied end up with a positive number. We've kind of used some of our basic knowledge of multiplying. You know, it doesn't really matter what order. So we've kind of broken up this -a times -b into separate bits, brought the -1 times -1 together, and really that's the essence of it. How do we get our head around that? One way that I hope some students might find helpful at least is this idea of you're jumping over 0 with your -1 times tables. So once you get into the negative territory, you're just jumping the other way. That's all you're doing. And so that kind of gets us to the result. Hopefully you found that helpful. And as I mentioned before, if you have other explanations that you think could really help clarify this result, please feel free to share in the comments. All right, tick boom.